Okay, so from the 14th century onwards, Ethiopia started to be considered by its Christian population as the Verus Israel, the Christian Ethiopians as the chosen people, and the kings as the legitimate heirs of King Solomon. This narrative provided the Ethiopian Christian rulers with a legal foundation for the claim for political authority over the kingdom. In the same way, but in the religious sphere, their status was supported with the institution of a religiously legitimated kingship, tracing back its roots to the Old Testament motifs, for example, the story of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba in the Book of Kings. These arguments were supported and promoted by the Kebra Nagast, a unified epic which has served a variety of important cultural functions, and its authority remained largely uncontested among the Amhara and Tigrinya-speaking communities of the Ethiopian highlands. There is a consensus, finally, amongst researchers that it was during the 14th century that this text, the Kebra Nagast, started to spread across the Ethiopian Christian kingdom. It has been argued that the date of the final redaction of this book is believed to have been around the 1320, a date that coincides with the early years of Amda Sion. And now you may ask, who is Amda Sion? So Amda Sion is recognized as one of the most important kings, Ethiopian kings, and a singular figure who left his mark in the political history of the Horn of Africa in the 14th century. The successful conquering campaigns carried out by this king were undoubtedly the most significant turning point for the development of the recently restored Solomonic dynasty, or Shosheret Solomonic in Shamatem, almost 60 years earlier in 1270. The appearance of this book of the Kebra Nagast might as well be seen as a symptom of the constant struggle between the central government trying to justify the right to rule and the peripheral regions, specifically between the Tigray and Amhara regions, a struggle which is commonly seen as one of the dominant themes in Ethiopian history. The regional and ethnic factor were, and sadly there still are, if you heard, if Shamatem Ma Kore Ethiopia, Gamba Shnatayim Achronot, the main reasons for the prolonged nature of a conflict that accompanied the development of Ethiopia even to this day. By the second half of the 14th century, a significant number of people from different regions with diverse religious and cultural backgrounds were living within the borders of the Ethiopian Christian kingdom. Indeed, this was a period of territorial expansion and evangelization. The situation becomes even more complex when we focus on the increasing power and influence of the monastic clergy or the monastic movement, who were primarily responsible for spreading the Christian faith among these people. By the 14th century, monasticism was the most effective means and virtually the only one for the expansion of the church and of the Christian faith. Just one sec. So here you have a map of Ethiopia, where you can see here the region of the Tigray, Aksum being the most important city, and here the region of Amhara, which is like what is now the center of Ethiopia. So the Christian kingdom policy concerning its frontier province has significantly influenced the way in which the monastic clergy behaved in these new territories. The need to attract non-Christian people to the church justified the development and behavior of the monastic movement, both within and beyond the new borders. The decision taken by those local saints were in most cases independent from the central hierarchy of the Ethiopian church. Some of the factors that may explain this typical configuration are merely geographical. There is a lot of mountains here, so it's very hard to get to some of these monasteries, and connected to the nature of the monasteries. But in addition, the fact that the church was headed by a foreign bishop of Egyptian origin up until the 20th century made it almost impossible to apply control and discipline from the center, and in most cases, nothing was done to avoid local departures from the official line. So you can see here, for example, here is, let's say that this is the center of Ethiopia, and here is Alexandria, where the bishop was supposed to come every time. So you can see how much he needed to travel every time they need to change. So the Christian kingdom policy concerning its frontier provinces has significantly influenced the way in which the monastic clergy behave in these new territories, as I said before. So, just one second. Hence, the role of this monastic movement was crucial, since it emerged as a significant force for the Christian and non-Christian population. This scenario might be summarized as follows. The 14th and 15th century was characterized by the biggest expansion of the Christian kingdom, but it was also a period when the Ethiopian church applied its pressures mostly on the non-Christian people of the area. So, however, such a transformation was a double-edged sword when considering the nature of the monastic community and its characteristic, especially if we acknowledge that the contact with new populations tended to provoke the most significant changes concerning beliefs and faith. The various monastic communities did not emerge nor develop independently of the rest of Ethiopian society, but rather those communities expressed the beliefs and expectations of the society. So before moving forward with the main subject of this paper, I believe that it is necessary to focus and describe the sources of our sources, or at least of my sources, that are mainly chronicles and hagiographies. But in this particular case, the case of Qozmos that I will introduce in a few minutes, they will rely in only one hagiographical work. So let's see here. So it was suggested that the hagiographic literature of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church could be grouped into two main categories. On the one hand, the fundamentally foreign works, which included the fundamental basis for Christian monasticism. For example, we may take as an example two works translated into Ethiopic from Greek, like the Life of Saint Anthony, written by Athanasius, or the Rule of Saint Pachomius. But we also have, on the other hand, we can situate the local and indigenous Ethiopian hagiographies, which focus on the saints who lived between particularly the 13th and the 16th century in Ethiopia. These hagiographies, the stories of saints or lives of the saints, depict the lives of many monastic leaders, as well as some kings. These works are central for the reconstruction of medieval Ethiopian history and essential, of course, for this paper. However, the first reliable allusion within Ethiopian Christian literature to the people, which at a later stage will be identified as Falasha, I guess most of you heard this word, seems to be within the chronicles of King Andak-Sion, the same king that we talked before, in the middle of the 14th century, sorry, when King Andak-Sion tried to expand and consolidate his kingdom. Some Judaized groups inhabiting the Lake Tana region, if we have the map, you'll see that it's in the center, decided to reject and oppose him and his expansion plans. But why to call them Judaized groups? Well, there might be an explanation that will help us to understand why I chose to carefully use different terms in order to describe what we popularly recognize as the Ethiopian Jews or Beta Israel, and sometimes in a derogatory way as Falashas. While the question of the origin of this term, let's see here. Okay. Great. While the question of the origin of this term lies outside the scope of this work and this presentation, it is important to highlight that the fact that the Ge'ez, ancient Ethiopic Tatika, term Falasha from the word Falasha, which means to emigrate, lithrosh, well, in some way, or to separate, started to be employed only from the 15th and 16th century onwards, in order to identify these Judaized groups inhabiting the Lake Tana northern region of Ethiopia. There is no evidence for its use of the word Falasha, at least in this sense, before the 15th century. And only from the 16th century, this word adopted and was widely adopted in order to describe the Jewish population in Ethiopia, even sadly to this day. The guest term, Ayhud, that sounds like Yehudim, and it also represents the same idea. Ayhud. Ayhud? That's a word. Yeah, you have it here. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Sounds very similar. It's also Semitic language. So this is a version of the word Yehudim, but also in the way Christians used to use it before also. So between the 13th and 16th century, the meaning of the word Ayhud in the context of theological and historical sources tends to be ambiguous and unclear. It was argued that the most common use of this term in the context of this period was as a description of groups and movements that were identified by an author as being in some way heretical. For this reason, it will not be advisable to adopt this term to refer to this particular religious community. So in 1332, these groups rose against the Solomonic ruler, Amda-Tzion. As a response of this revolt, Amda-Tzion sent some troops to fight back these rebels in the region of Simeon and Wagara and Salant and Sagade. And according to the sources, as you can see here, these people were Christians, but now they denied Christ like the Jews, Kama Ayhud, what is written here, who crucified him. For this reason, he, the king Amda-Tzion, sent an army to destroy them. These clashes represent the first stage of an almost 300 years old conflict between Beth Israel and the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia. The expedition was a success for the king, not for the Beth Israel, and the way was clear for evangelizing these lands. In this regard, it is essential to note that the intensification of these clashes and their characteristics must be seen in the context of these events that were taking part in Ethiopia during the first half of the 14th century. So as the Christian expansion was taking place, some of the non-Christian and autonomous groups living within the newly established limits of the kingdom strongly resisted and fought the Solomonic ruler in his attempt to consolidate his rule over his recently conquered lands. By the end of Amda-Tzion period of rule and during the first years of the reign of Saifa Arad, his son, we can find some reference to the intensive activities of some clerics around the Lake Tana area. According to the life of Yafkerana Exi, the saint that we'll see now in a few minutes, the northern and eastern areas, you can see here, this is the Lake Tana, the second biggest lake in Africa. The first lake is Lake Victoria. So, okay, let's keep moving. So it was around less than 10 years from Saifa Arad's ascension to the throne that Abba was Totewos, one of the most charismatic saints of this period, passed away in Armenia following a lengthy exile. Abba was Totewos. Let's see here, we have a picture. Okay, here I marked, you can see here, this is the Lake Tana more closely. If you heard, like, אם שמעתם אולי כאילו על העיר לליבלה, יש את הכנסיות שהן, איך אומרים, כאילו, רוקהאון, כן, שזה נורא מרשים גם, אז זה נמצא די קרוב לשם. רוב היהודים שהגיעו לכאן גם הם באים מהעשור הזה, גם מסמיאן שזה עשור יותר ערבי. So, Abba Ewosoteos, here we have a picture of him, was born in 1273, 3 years after the so-called restoration of the Solomonic dynasty by Yekuno Amlak in 1217. His monastic movement, which emerged from the northern region of the kingdom, will pave the way for the emergence of a form of Christianity that eventually will become the dominant Christian practice in northern Ethiopia. It was in these remote frontier lands where pupils of Abba Ewosoteos followers managed to attract a large number of followers, both Christian and non-Christians. The characteristics of these movements were summarized by King Sara Yaakov, maybe the most important king of this period you can see here. It's by the end of the second half of the 15th century. And he describes this group as follows. Pay attention here. The disciples of Ewosoteos observed the Shabbat, Saturday and Sunday, but they did not enter, a lot of weekends. The weekend, so it was a long weekend, but they did not enter in the residence of the king, nor in the house of the metropolitans, of the bishops. And they did not receive the holy orders because the observance of the Shabbat was not enforced in the kingdom, and the Shabbat was abolished in the realm of the patriarchs of Alexandria in Egypt. Among the followers who joined Ewosoteos in his journey and came back to Ethiopia from Armenia. As I told you before, he was here also. He passed through the Holy Land and he went up to Armenia. There are a few stories that describe also in other places his way. So among these followers was Gabra Yasus, from a number of clerics that were active in the region around Lake Tana, where we see before, and that had contact with this Judaized population of the area. This saint, Gabrayasu, was the first relevant character recognized as being directly involved in the evangelization efforts among the Jews of Ethiopia. His activities in the region of Infras, that is in the region of Tigray today, an area inhabited by these Jewish groups or Judaized groups, represent a new factor in the development of the monastic movement in Ethiopia. Gabrayasu's, here you can see where Beth Israel were like around that time, okay, in the area of Lake Tana, Gondar, and Aksum in the Tigray. So he founded a monastery in that region, and his strategic location was, the idea was to reach the Falasha, and he was the only 14th century cleric who managed to spread the Christian teachings among them. Gabrayasus, as one of the most notable members of the Wasutean movement, as we said before, a religious monastic group that adopted some biblical observance, and among them the Saturday Shabbat, might have been attracted and linked to them in some way. However, we must say a few words to understand a little bit better this connection, okay, between a Christian monastic saint in some way and a Jewish group living there. So let's talk a little bit about like 3 important points concerning the, how are we time? We're good now. 3 minutes. 3 minutes more? Oh, okay, I will take a little bit more, okay? I will try to have only the story and that's all. So it's important to say that the Ethiopian Jews of Beth Israel, they incorporate a peculiar mixture of Judaic Christian beliefs and rites, yeah? But we also need to understand that the Christian faith also incorporates several Judaic beliefs and rites. It's not that it's only coming from that way, yeah? We sometimes forget. They were completely innocent of Hebrew, so all their work was in Ge'ez, in Ethiopic. And they took a lot of books also from the Ethiopian dominant tradition in that way. So this combination of political, social, and religion factors that I presented before, very much likely was instrumental for the Beth Israel in emerging as an independent religious group, entity, and identity at some point between the 14th and the 16th century. I'm not saying that the Beth Israel did not start to develop before. We just have not any historical source that may prove or justify this claim. When considering the changing religious and social climate of this period in Ethiopia, we might suggest that during the 14th century, the process of construction of this autonomic identity intensified. So let's jump to the story of Qozmos. That is, I will leave for the end. So who is Qozmos? So the story of Qozmos portrays a very different kind of encounter that the one described above. Qozmos was a Tigrayan monk from the north who decided to join a monastery in the Lake Tana right before Yakfekerena Ex's death in 1372. Here you have the name, this is a saint. And I will talk a little bit about the one who translated and worked on this source specifically. This hagiography published at the Istituto Orientale in Rome by Isaac Weinberg in 1936, as you can see here. It's a very special story. Why? Because Weinberg, a Jew, was born in 1878, but little is known about his life. We know that in 1917, he completed his PhD dissertation under the linguist Franz Pretorius at the Warsaw University. But Weinberg was arrested in 1925 because of his leftist and radical political views in Poland, but he was then pardoned thanks to the intervention of some French scholars. He died in Warsaw in July 1941. At the beginning, I thought it was because of the Holocaust, but it was not. It was after a long illness, and he was buried at the expense of the Jewish community in Poland, and he was eulogized by the well-known scholar Meir Balaban. Maybe some of you know the name. This same scholar was killed in Auschwitz 1 year after. Here you have the grave of Weinberg. It was hard to find, but we find it. So the cultural and religious impact on the Beth Israel that the encounter between this renegade Christian monk and the community that adopted him was critical for the later development and shaping of this community of the Beth Israel. Qozmos quarreled with the head of his monastery, mainly on the question of consecrating women as nuns. Qozmos was defined as a rigid and radical ascetic. He decided to live in a separate cell and refuse all cooked food and preferred to eat pigs soaked in water. Qozmos also declined the Eucharist, a very important thing in Christianity, arguing that it was prepared with baked bread. According to this life of Yafkerana Exi, he was accused of heresy, mainly because of his decision of avoiding this type of food. So after abandoning and escaping his monastery in Huayna because of his extreme ascetic practice, he arrived in the region in Semyan and Salam when he survived eating rules for a while. Eventually, he was warmly welcomed by those who professed the faith of the Jews. So according to this life, you can see here, the people of Semyan and Salam lived in the Jewish faith behind Manota Haidut and were exceedingly evil and thoughtless. Remember that the one who writes this is a Christian, of course. When those hereticals once saw Qozmos living in the wasteland, they gave him food to eat, but he refused to accept it. They asked him, "What do you eat?" He said to them, "If you have honey, give it to me so that I may eat." They say to him, "Can you write?" He said to them, "Yes." They brought him honey and milk, and he copied the Orit for them. The Orit is another name for the Octateuch, or כאילו פשוט התנ"ך, שהוא תרגם כנראה. יש איזה קשר בין הזה, אבל יש בא מהמילה אור, פשוט כי זה כמובן. אז כן, so Qozmos felt attracted to ascetic practices and values adopted by this community living in these regions. He also provided them with water, he sanctified the water and helped them heal their sick. And ultimately, the Aihud started to believe that Qozmos was a messianic and half-divine figure. So the former Christian monk soon became their political leader, and his new community assisted him in gathering a great army, which then attacked the Christians in the region of Dambeya and Beganmir. We'll jump because we don't have more time. So according to the sources, the faith of the Jews would be strengthened and enlightened in the religious sense of the word, thanks to the contribution of this saint for the Bet Israel Qozmos, who is said to have written the Orit, as I said before. So in the end, the king, after sent his troop, he destroyed all the community there, and the revolt was suppressed in some way. But the important thing is that this revolt, however, provides us with a notion of the tension created within the Aihud communities following the evangelization Christian process. The Aihud were anxious to acquire religious texts from renegade Christians, but some reacted violently against forced conversion. It is clear that Aihud-Christian relations intensified during the 14th century, following the expansion of the Christian kingdom to newly conquered regions, leading to a conflict in the early 15th century that the surviving oral and written sources suggest was a turning point in Beta Israel history. So, in conclusion, we must be aware of the beginning of a process that was taking place in parallel to the Christian proselytizing activities on the non-Christian communities during the 14th and 15th century. The sons of the Jews began to enrich their own religious legacy and textual legacy from the surrounding Christian environment. A considerable part of their literary and organizational borrowings might date for this particular period. Hence, it will be hard to understand the history of the Bet Israel without focusing on this period, which started around the second half of the 14th century and continued well into the 15th century. Thank you very much. I'm sorry.